Aloha, everyone. Welcome to
Aloha.
Pacific Historic Parks History Talks. I'm Jim McCoy, the Director of Communications for PHP, and we're pleased to have you join us today for a very special webinar. PHP is a nonprofit organization who works in partnership with the National Park Service. Together, we support the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, which is the home of the USS Arizona Memorial, which is a big part of this talk today. The War in the Pacific National Historical Park in Guam, the American Memorial Park in Saipan, Kalapapa National Historical Park in Molokai, and Diamond Head State Monument in Hawaii. So they basically, under our umbrella, we have 5 parks, 4 of them federal and 1 of them state. Our mission at PHP is to remember, honor, and understand World War II in the Pacific. History Talks is an interactive series designed to share the history and stories of Pearl Harbor and World War II. Today, as we approach the 60th anniversary of the USS Arizona Memorial, we are honored to be speaking with Professor Axel Schmitzberger, a licensed architect and professor at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. He's the curator of the exhibit Alfred Preis Displaced, which is coming to the Pearl Harbor National Memorial on May the 30th till July the 15th. And he's also an author of an upcoming book on Alfred Preis. This presentation also features Laura McGuire, architecture and design historian and assistant professor of architectural history at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, my alma mater. She too is writing a book. So with that, we'll get started with both you professors, and by our discussion earlier, I'm going to call you Axel and Laura by name, and you can call me Jim, and we can have a great talk, and we're going to allow questions to come in at the end of the seminar. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Jim and Weston, to set this up. Hello, everybody. It's nice to meet you all, and thanks for coming. Laura, glad to be here with you.
You too.
And want to quickly start launching right into our slideshow here. And the way we broke it down in a few kind of larger chapters, so that Laura and I can talk about this in kind of like a split discourse, and hopefully make this interesting for everybody here. The title of the exhibit that is coming up, and it's just to be kind of clear, I'm doing only a catalog for the exhibit. It looks like a book, but it's a catalog. And Laura is actually writing the biography on Alfred Preis with a few other contributors. And the show is called Alfred Preis Displaced, the Tropical Modernism of the Austrian Emigrant and Architect of the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. And just to contextualize, the reason why I'm involved is because I'm by birth as well Austrian, and I'm a part-time resident in Hawaii, but I live mostly in California, where I teach. And I contacted Laura, I think about, 2 years ago or 3 years ago? I don't remember.
I think it was first 3 years ago, and then again 2 years ago.
Right, and so we, with the idea of doing something on the relatively forgotten architect Alfred Preis, who designed the famous USS Arizona Memorial, and so this collaboration kind of like emerged out of her original work and research into an online exhibit, and then now into a fully fleshed physical exhibit that is touring now the United States. We just had a show in New York. I'm going to quickly jump into the slideshow. And first I want to talk about the context of Alfred Preis, Vienna years, 1911 to 1939. And Alfred Preis was born on February 2nd, 1911. So we are celebrating currently the 111th anniversary of Alfred Preis. And he was born in Vienna into a Jewish working class family. And his father, who you see in the picture as well, Ignaz Preis, was quite a pragmatic mechanic, salesman, second generation Viennese, whose family had originally emigrated from the Hungarian countryside into the metropole of Austria-Hungarian Empire, which is Vienna. It was a dual monarchy in the mid to late 1800s. He married Alfred Preis's mother, Hermine, on a year before Alfred Preis was born in 1910, and she was equally Hungarian and part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. She was born in Sopron, but they also married. This photo also includes his Alfred Preis's younger brother Fritz Preis, who was born a year later than Alfred Preis. Quickly, to establish a bit of a context of Austria and Vienna, we are in history talks after all. Vienna used to be the dual seat of the dual monarchy of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that reigned and was one of the most powerful empires of the late 19th and beginning 20th century. It is pretty much located on the crossroads between the east and west and south and north, and was quite a significant cultural hub of Europe, of the now emerging industrializing Europe. Here you see a photo of what is called the Ringstraße. We come back to this, with the famous Staatsoper, which is the main opera, the national opera of Vienna. Furthermore, to establish context, in post-World War I, after Austria had to admit that it was part of the defeated parties in the conflict, was shrunk by various treaties to a marginal size of its original empire. It went from a 56 million state to basically a 6 million little state. It still has the same boundaries now, and but was heavily inundated by fleeing peasants in this case, or fleeing population that emigrated from the countryside or from former ethnic states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Vienna. And so the metropole grew within like a few months to 2 million overpopulated, underdeveloped environment. And this led for the new democratic, the so-called first democracy, or the first republic of Austria, that lasted between 1918 to 1938. It led to a boom in building. We had, with the influx of people and of veterans, we also had obviously an influx of a lot of intellectuals, and so architects and other planners started to think of living quality rather than living design. And so the Karl Marxov, which is kind of like the most representative of those buildings, came about in 1930 and was part of this living fortress program that would take care of a massive amount of population with compact, minimal units, but also with courtyards and other amenities, shopping center, etc., so that the population would be taken care of. The monarchy was short-lived. In 1927, conflicts between the various parties, including communists, social democrats, National Social Labor Party, it's the Nazi Party, and the conservative Christian Social Democrats, came to a full-on conflict from street skirmishes to civil war and the burning of the Justice Palace. The result was that obviously most parties got banned by the leading parties, and as history tells us, bans stop the course of actions but don't solve the problems on the ground. And hence, in 1934, the then leading prime minister got assassinated, was replaced by a more radical, right-leaning, anti-immigration, anti-Semitic prime minister, and who then also developed the so-called corporate state in order to avoid labor unions forming, and all that came to a halt when Austria was annexed in 1938, in April 1938, by the German Nazi Reich, basically. Alfred Preis, however, and this is also always true for Vienna. It's always a city of contrast. Alfred Preis was fairly unpolitical from what we understand. He was mostly interested in the cultural context of the city. And here you see a photo of a famous opera ball this was taken in 1938 in the National Opera, and the first district, St. Stephen and other places. And here you see Alfred Preis actually living his cultural art informed lifestyle, which was probably considered bohemian at that time. This is in front of the St. Charles Church in Vienna. And you may notice that people were driving on the left at that time, like most people used to drive left in all countries until 1938-39, when the Nazis switched to right side riding. That then took over for the rest of the world. Here's quickly a context of Vienna of Alfred Preis. In the green place is the so-called Freihaus. This used to be an 18th century large communal housing project, one of the largest in Europe, that had by 1920 seen a lot better days and was mostly used by an impoverished working class as residents. There were mechanical shops and gas stations and other places in there. On the left to the long red bar, or light red bar, this would be the future Naschmarkt, which used to be a grocery market, an open market. And on the right, you see the Technical University and the St. Charles Church. And in the yellow dotted line with all the buildings attached to it is the so-called ring, which is the replacement of the former glacis and fortifications of the city of Vienna that separates the outer districts from the central district, the first district. And attached to it is in the upper right corner, you see the National Opera. Further right, you see the Künstlerhaus and the Konzerthaus, all famous places. And on the left, you see the very small dot is the Viennese Secession, the Art Nouveau building that probably most people are familiar with, and the Academy of Arts, and then museums of natural and historic sciences, and above then the palace. The Freihaus is in the meantime demolished, and Alfred Preis in the 1930s was already a good student. He shifted from being an avid opera fan and even a clapper in operas to studying architecture after he met his future wife, Jana Wernikowska, in Salzburg in 1930, and realized that in order to be able to marry her, because she was of higher social standing, he would need to get a proper job. And so he studied architecture at the Technical Hochschule, which is now the Technical University of Vienna, which is my alma mater. And he had excellent grades, actually. He got scholarships. And here you see one of his projects. The reason why I point this project out above, this is from 1938, Heilstätte für tuberkulosegefährdete Kinder, which is a tuberculosis sanatorium. Alfred Preis actually, at the age of 4, contracted tuberculosis and was sent to a sanatorium, which informed in large his cultural background, because he was raised properly there for the time being by educated nurses and other people. And you can see here also some of his preferences to a much more modern leaning architecture. Below, you see the famous architect Adolf Loos's project for a winter sport hotel and another hotel in the Viennese region. that he proposed in the early 1910s. And you can kind of loosely see the relationship between Preiss's design and these below. So we can understand that he was leaning less to the more neoclassical conservative architectural language, but much more to the more contemporary modern aesthetic. All of these efforts of Alfred Preis becoming an architect more or less came to a halt when the Germans annexed Austria. The Alfred Preis miraculously made his wedding happen. He was obviously Jewish, but he had converted in 1936 to Catholicism. So he made sure that his future wife, Jana, was taken care of. She was actually a stateless adopted child by a famous Viennese physician. When he was incarcerated in Kokand in the former Soviet area from World War I, and took her mother with him and her kids, and so she was adopted, but she had no state belonging basically. So he married her in a whirlwind action within 2 days of the annexation of Austria, so that she would save. And he still had to finish school, and somehow he managed to graduate in 1938 in May. And from then on, he feverishly attempted to leave the country. It was clearly not secure and safe for Jewish people to stay in Austria at this point.
I just want to interject something too, Axel, is that the fact that Preis was allowed to remain to study at the Technische Hochschule was in and of itself miraculous, because immediately after the annexation, all Jewish students and faculty members were kicked out of the university. So it's possible that Preis, because of his conversion, was sort of overlooked by the Nazi apparatus for a little bit. Time.
Yeah, he seems he was one of 3 or 4 Jewish students that were able to remain until they graduated, basically. And so Alfred Preis, for a year, he attempted feverishly to leave the country until he managed to secure a commitment from an office in the state of Hawaii, which was territory of Hawaii at the time, still of Donald Conrad, and immediately after that, he was able to secure sponsorship to leave Austria, and then he attempted for another few months to get passports for him and his wife, which was equally difficult at the time. But he managed on April 1st. There's a longer story to that Laura is working on extensively in her book, and I've given a brief glimpse at in the catalog as well. He managed to leave on the Queen Mary, the RMS Queen Mary, that sits, interesting enough, now in the port of Long Beach here in California. Leave for New York on April 1st, and then he arrived in New York April 6th. His brother also fled 2 days earlier to the United States, ended up in Pennsylvania. His parents, unfortunately, perished with so many other Jews. The exact details are unclear. We do have some traces of where they ended up, but we don't know the exact fate. And it is also unclear whether Alfred Preis really knew all the details. He didn't return to Vienna until the 1980s, actually. But his mother vanished at some point in Riga, and his father, I think, ended up in Almaty in Kazakhstan, where they both perished. He left New York on May 20th, 1939, and on a freighter, which was another interesting adventure that takes on a lot of details. Because at this time, the United States were preparing for war, so traveling on private travel on ships was restricted, and so it was very difficult for him to find passage. And so he found the freighter Savockler of the Pioneer Freight Line to go along the Atlantic coast down the Panama Canal, Californian, and then Honolulu, Hawaii, where they arrived on June 22nd in 1939, the first time in 2 years that he ultimately was safe. And with that, I'm switching over to his early years in Hawaii that Laura will be able to talk about.
Hi, yeah. So he was extremely lucky to escape. He wrote letters in his own oral history to over 100 architecture firms in the United States of what he says was a very outdated architecture directory, and was able to secure a job with the firm of Dahl and Conrad in Honolulu. Now, this in and of itself is amazing given the number of architects and designers who were trying to flee the country at this time. But the thing is about Dahl and Conrad is that they were probably the most progressive modernist architectural firm in Hawaii at that time. And we'll see a few of the buildings that Preis designed for them. But it's really clear, especially from the work of Connie Conrad, why he would have had a certain affinity to Preis, and also within the context of, Dahl and Conrad is trying to kind of bring modernism to Hawaii, they would have wanted to have a European modernist. So here we're seeing Alfred Preis pictured here with, I believe that's Connie Conrad, and walking down the street together.
Yeah.
The whole story of his first day of arrival is an interesting one, which I unfortunately can't get into, but suffice it to say, at one point their car was broken into and their passports were stolen, and Preis was convinced that the Gestapo had followed them all the way to Honolulu. Oh gosh, unfortunately I have a power tool going on in my background, so hang on one second, just a moment.
Yeah, I can jump in on this. So in that photo you see Bjarne Kato, Dahl, Connie Conrad, and Alfred Preis. Alfred Preis is the tall guy, and Connie Conrad was actually only 1 year apart from Alfred Preis, and Connie Conrad was a jeweler's son originally and became actually quite a famous character on the island in the long run. So
I'm back. We got the power tool shut off. So in the early years, Preis mostly, and I'd say just the first year really, Preis mostly did interiors for Dahl and Conrad, but then he began to branch out and do his own commissions, and was eventually appointed an associate at the firm. And these are two of his early commissions. One is the Cow Corner on the left, which is very much this sort of a style that we call the streamline moderne, which was a popular style in the US, with these sorts of curving lines and big lettering in modernist styles, lots of glass block. So this is kind of a classic streamline moderne building, adapted very much for the tropical climate with those deep overhangs, which is very much what Dahl and Conrad were trying to do in terms of fusing all of these elements of modernism. And then on the right, we have an extremely important building in that it was one of Preis's first sole authored housing commissions, the Scudder residence and apartments. And we can see little hints of Dahl and Conrad in this, kind of curving balcony. But the rest of it is extremely Viennese in its absolute kind of box-like precision. And this is one of the things that we saw in the earlier sanatorium project that Axel mentioned. But it's something that Preis very much brings to Honolulu with his work on with Dahl and Conrad. So next slide. And you can see this kind of precision again coming through with two of Preiss's also early commissions. One is a housing design that he did on the left, and the other is the Jade Building, or what used to be called the Jade Building, because the entire thing was faced with emerald green vitrolite tile, which must have been an absolute sight to see at the time. And we have these sort of like ships motifs in the building on the right, which is very much coming out of the streamlined moderne and European modernism, but with these sort of folded sections. And then this very precise ordering of windows, which is very much coming out of Viennese modernism, plus just the whole kind of compact profile of the building. So next slide. So unfortunately, all of this came to a dead halt for Preiss after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 in December. December 7th, actually, when, of course, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And 2 days later, Alfred Preis and his wife were with other basically German-speaking peoples, recent immigrants and longtime immigrants alike, were rounded up along with all of the Axis powers cohort, including the Italians and the Japanese, and interred at the Sand Island detention camp. So what we're looking at here is the pink and the red were prisoner of war camps. So the Italian prisoner of war and the Japanese prisoner of war camps. But the orange were the civilian camps. And this is where Japanese civilians from Hawaii who were deemed possibly a threat, although there was actually a list made beforehand much earlier on, which is a whole different story. And then the Germans and the Italians there as well. And, you know, Preiss talks about being amazed at how immaculate the Japanese keep their own prisoner camp, of, you know, having these decorative kind of shell gardens and stone gardens in front of their tents, and just being so impressed with the aesthetics of Japanese culture. So life on Sand Island was honestly pretty horrific. Preiss kind of glosses over his treatment at the camps, which he doesn't in his own oral history, but they were treated very, very badly, to say the least. Preiss was forced to, in his own words, scrub toilets and latrines with his bare hands at bayonet point. And the prisoners were forced to construct their own housing, which we're seeing here happening with these tents. Although for the first few months, they quite literally slept on the ground on blankets, and Preiss had terrible headaches through the whole time. Of course, in Hawaii, January is the rainy season, so it gets chilly here and cold at night, and he suffered quite terribly. So next slide. And then finally, so they were arrested in December, and then finally, about 4 months later, Preiss was able to secure his release through a former client, Chester C. Clark, who actually was the largest concrete quarry owner in Hawaii. And we're seeing here pictured on the right. The lower green portion is the quarry itself, and then there's an upper green dot. I just want to say a few quick words about Preiss's involvement in this quarry. So Preiss was Chester Clark put Preiss to work. operating backhoes and doing all sorts of things. So Preis really like learned the mechanics of concrete, how it was made, the elements that went into it. And this is really, really important, as Axel's going to talk about, for his development of a regional Hawaii modernism, which is very much based in concrete as a locally available and economic material, because, you know, obviously materials shipped from the mainland are very expensive. So here Preis got kind of an intimate look at concrete. But the little section in green at the top are a series of houses. Next slide. Are a series of houses that Chester Clark commissioned as workers' housing by Alfred Preis, because not only did he put him to work digging stuff, but also put him to work as an architect. And the story of these buildings is really interesting because, you know, on the one hand, we have these, you know, very sort of straightforward, you know, almost getting to post-war Hawaii homes, but we see these large infills of glass at the corners, and especially this slanted window, which is a reoccurring theme in Preis's work. And these houses were really interesting because of the fact that wartime materials were rationed, and therefore regular materials were hard to come by, but Preis was actually able to get much more expensive building materials from the mainland at low rates, by virtue of the fact that they were not rationed. So next slide. And we again see this reoccurring theme here of this slanted window in the residence that that he had designed. We're not sure whether it was earlier for Chester Clark, although we think so because they had a relationship, or whether this house was then later planned. It says IA Heights, but it might have actually been planned for the Quarry site too.
It was, yeah.
Yeah,
it was designed in January in 1941, and it was, I think, only a proposal because Darling Conrad had built in 1938 already a residence for Clark.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So Axel's drawn a few lines here, but here we see Preis's own kind of form language being developed here of these very angular lines that again are kind of articulated in the window, but you know, these parallelisms coming through where everything is designed very much in accord with the angles of the site itself. So next slide. And at this time as well, Preis was also able to design an unrealized project with the very, very famous Hawaii regionalist architect Hart Wood for an airport in Kihei Lagoon, which is this sort of amazing structure, both because it is also done in the streamlined modern style, where we definitely see Preis with these, you know, sort of swooping lines and curving angles. But Axel and I were just recently talking about the fact that this kind of like long extension very much has to do with strands of German modernism, even under the Nazis, coming through in possibly the design for Tempelhof Airport. So I know this is getting very architecturally but my main emphasis is that, you know, Preis with Hart Wood is using all of these different influences together. So
and I'm going to quickly jump into what would be interesting for some people that are interested in World War II history. This is an airport designed actually for the Navy originally, but meant to be a civilian airport. The Navy wanted to acquire the land of Kihei Lagoon and engaged architects to design an airport. Nobody had designed an airport at this time yet. This was a complete novel infrastructure, and so Preis went on to actually reflect on the current technologies and the future. So I interviewed with Pan Am, and the design itself was actually a dual airport for amphibian airplanes and for land landing airplanes. Interestingly enough, of course, this is pretty much in the location of the current airport, the Rogers Airport, and by 1944, 1945, when it ultimately got built or began building, amphibian aircrafts were obsolete as a transport vehicle, and so this actually never saw realization. I'm going to quickly jump in, and I'm going to be a lot briefer right now, even though this is for us as architects the most interesting part. But I do recognize that we do have other people architects. I'm quickly going to outline his 20 years of practice, which is unbelievably productive for the time being that he spent on it, and it was. He built in this time period over 160. He built 160 houses and other types of structures, public infrastructures. And the reason why we do like this chapter particularly is because also it informs and leads us then to this most accomplished project, the Arizona Memorial. Quickly influenced, Alfred Preis, as we pointed out, cites himself 4 major influences. One, on the top left, you see the Doppelhaus by Adolf Loos and Heinrich Kulke, a very modern, complex, spatial house. Even though it looks very simple from the exterior, the interior is actually a very interlocking volumes aesthetic. And on the left on top, you see the Honaunau Halle in the National Park in Honaunau on the Big Island, which is a 17th century or 18th century reconstruction of a Halle that also equally influenced Preis in his designs. And on the lower left, you see Sigmund Freud, who in Preis's own names, kind of informed his way of thinking and orienting himself towards the client with the proper questioning, not trying to say what you want, but actually trying to understand what the client needs. So he learned a lot from the psychoanalytical techniques. And on the bottom right, you see Richard Wagner, the composer, who was Preis's favorite composer, and Wagner introduced the concept of the leitmotif, which means the guiding principle through musical themes that then was translated into architecture by Preis. And these leitmotifs you can see in various examples. I'm just showing you without naming them all, where he deals a lot with color, geometry, with an open kitchen, which is very relatively contemporary at the time still, and then with material qualities, particularly in this case, the oozing mortar, concrete block, brick walls. Another very important thing is what we call displacement, and that kind of hints towards the other portion of the show. That he, as a modernist, did not pursue the orthography in plans always, but actually was interested in a very complex layered overlapping of geometries, and this way some of the rooms themselves were not clear in how they were oriented, and so a very interesting spatial complexity emerged out of this. And this shows on the interior and exterior equally. Here you see one house on the left is the Chopin residence from 1949 on Mele Mele, up in the Woodlawn area, and on the left you see the Lau residence from 1951, where also the play with color and material and geometry is very prominent. He continued this throughout about 150 built residences that I'm just gonna quickly introduce here for this few slides. He had other light motifs that carried through, horizontality, butterfly roofs, these the bay windows turning into architectural objects, such as in the lower left, the Tuthill residence, and on the lower right, the most famous one, where he dissolved the spatial boundaries of the house and basically had an interior that was more an exterior space. So you see here the Harrison residence from 1961, where literally no room had any full enclosure. It was all like indoor outdoor living at this point. So very Hawaiian, but also very modern. And what would be important here to say is that a lot of these aspects started shaping and co-informing part of the modern language of Hawaii, where traditional tropes like overhangs of roofs, cross ventilation, lifting up the building very often to avoid like insects and rot actually happening, and all these things kind of like played a role in his design. In public or in the larger sphere, he built also very importantly the Laupahoehoe High School, which was also a very important example that was a collaboration with some of the other leading modernists under the moniker Associated Architects. Was begun after the tsunami of 1946 that hit the Big Island pretty hard on the Laupahoehoe region, and the new school was built. And here, materiality, window horizontality, as Laura pointed out, they are very much kind of like beginning to emerge as the main themes for Alfred Preis's architecture, where he started seeking local, regional influences, or introducing regional influences, but also equally superimposing his Viennese modernist tendencies. And on the right, I always like to point this out, he also built the first shopping mall in Hawaii. In 1954, the Manoa shopping center, which got demolished in 2006 or 2005, I think. That was also a very important piece of infrastructure that was just about to emerge in the 1950s based on some principles that his co-expatriate Victor Grün promoted. He went on to also engage with the more left-leaning progressive groups such as the labor unions, the LWU, and built their headquarters throughout the islands. The very important one you can see on Atkinson Drive still standing is the LWU Memorial Association, which was finished in 1952, and again features some of his very prominent horizontalities of window bands, but also some very interesting features inside that we don't have time right now to exhibit. And on the right, you see also another very important piece, that part of the story that is important for Preis. Preis was very engaged with preserving the natural landscape of the island, and also interested in giving back to the public the green space, actually. So he designed a lot of parks, and with that, the Honolulu Zoo is probably the most relevant of these projects, that also hints from a couple of architectural design motifs to the next big piece of his architecture, the First United Methodist Church, where again you see here, this is an older color postcard from the 1960s by Irving Rosen. But you can see his extensive use of very creative concrete with large lava rock aggregates and an expressive roof form that then again played out in plan and section in a relationship where he uses an anamorphic technique to create an overly perspectival effect. That again then would show up as a design motif also in this project, the USS Arizona Memorial. I guess that's why most of you are attending this lecture today. But the USS Arizona Memorial is a long story, actually, and it began already in 1943 when Alfred Preis urged to reopen the AIA chapter, the local AIA chapter of Honolulu, because he saw a need for architectural discourse that leads them away from the daily work that most of the architects that were pretty much out of jobs throughout the war years had to do, because most of the local architects, if they did move away, were actually designing barracks for the Navy and the military, and or engaged in more larger civil engineering projects. And the USS Arizona Memorial emerged as a project already at this time. And obviously, the key aspect of this event was clearly the sinking of the USS Arizona with that many, over 1,000 sailors on board. This is one of those very dramatic moments where this is right after the explosion of her forward magazines. This was taken from board the USS Solace. It's actually a video film that I haven't found yet, but I found the stills of it. These activities were immediately picked up. Preis was extremely moved by the events and was a staunch advocate. And also he was very interested in collaboration with his colleagues. And so he, was heavily engaged in the AIA business and also sought positions in the AIA to unify some of the ideas. And with him were many famous local architects, and you can see them in those various news clipping pictures. And I'm not going to go there right now, but amongst them are obviously Alfred Preis, Rurik, Sims, and Tucker Gratz is also in those images. Seckel architect, Pete Wimberly, Sims, Morris, and Osipov, which you can't really see very well, but he's in the very right image here, together with Merrill Sims and Tucker Gratz. And they developed something that is called a Pacific Memorial System, which was in collaboration with, as I mentioned, the name Tucker Gratz, the Pacific War Memorial Commission that was established in the post-war years in 1949. To raise funds to memorize these tragic events. And you can see in this drawing from 1953, approximately 1953, that is actually presented here by Osipov in the upper right image, the several stations of these memorials. And this was not just like the USS Arizona Memorial, but it was events at the Punch Bowl National Cemetery. It included the Fort de Russy Memorial, Recreation Center. Focused on some stations along the Pacific Memorial Boulevard, and also had an auditorium planned at Diamond Head Crater. But what you can see, however, is that as early as in the 1950s, we do know that there was an idea about memorizing this tragic event of the USS Arizona. Of course, this was politically not very popular because why would you want to remember this day in infamy? Yeah, as this was cited by various presidents and governors and senators at this time. And so the Tucker Gratz with the Pacific War Memorial Commissions and also in constant collaboration with the AIA sought out to raise funds and money to memorize the memorial. In the upper left, you see what we believe is the earliest proposal by Alfred Preis from 1950. At least the description that Alfred Preis gave suits this image, with a large memorial wall on Ford Island, a bridge crossing over to the wreck of the Arizona, and basically a ring of torches around the outline of the wreck, plus an obelisk. All these things were mentioned by Preis in one of his designs. It seems like these several people engaged in this design processes, and there were other ideas coming forth from civilians and Navy people. Recently discovered on the right is a 1953 proposal by an unknown author, probably the veterans. This is a DAV. This is, I think this is, his name is Ming, Floyd Ming of the veterans DAV. And they proposed a kind of like this elliptical shaped memorial. And then in 1958, 1959, during the larger fundraising action, some other designs surfaced, of which we do not know the authors right now, but these are all coming out of news clippings. Fundraising
this is Ralph
was
Edwards speaking to you
a
from
bit
Pearl
slow.
Harbor on Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. The planes you see coming now are friendly
Here
US
is
Navy
Ralph
planes, of course.
Edwards
17 years ago, they were enemy bombers who
promoting
struck this
the
great Pacific naval
fundraising
base in a
for the
surprise
USS
attack that
Arizona
ushered
Memorial.
in what has been called
By
the day which will live in infamy.
1958,
This is our story, as seen
Congress
through the eyes
finally
of one
allowed
who was there.
to let's just, yep.
This is Your Life, the program for all America.
Oops. By 1950, and I'm going to go back to this slide in a second. I wanted to quickly pause this here. Yeah. So by 1958, Congress finally granted the Navy to access public funds and public fundraising funds. And so the fund drive got in full swing. It was a bit slow, but people like Elvis Presley, particularly in 1960, with his famous concert in March 25th, raised quite a substantial sum that went directly to the Pacific War Memorial Commission. And Ralph Edwards was extremely instrumental in the fundraising. Francis of South Pacific movie fame also aided in fundraising, as well as many others, Jerry Lewis. And so by 1959, the design contract was awarded to Johnson Perkins and Alfred Preis. Johnson Perkins worked with Alfred Preis frequently over the years. They were friends and colleagues. This is the proposal that was put forth in 1959, in December 1959. It is very similar to the proposal that we already are familiar with right now. However, it was in size a lot longer. On the left, you see the 1959 proposal versus the final proposal that was then built on the right. And it had different dock situation and obviously different programming on the inside. Alfred Preis originally had proposed an underwater room that allowed the viewing of the sunken ship as a quasi-sarcophagus viewing, which is like a very Viennese attitude, where you have royal catacombs where you look at the remains of royals directly. And that was clearly too morbid for most people, but also the Navy simply rejected it because it still required a bridge from Ford Island, which the Navy did not want to do. And so the following proposal was this catenary shape. Catenary are structural hanging shapes, basically, that can be inverted into arcs. And so it was in plan and in section equally a catenary piece that had also viewing holes to the ship itself. And after a few optimization processes, this project was put into planning in the shorter version. I think it's now at 183 feet long. And here you see actually the plans stamped by Alfred Preis. So this little signature down here, this circular thing, is actually Alfred Preis's architect seal. So we do know that he was ultimately the leader of the design process. And here we are showing a bit of the construction sequence of the memorial itself. It was a tricky process to put piles into the sand, partially because you're on a floating platform that is moved by the ocean, and you need to drive large piles into the sand to sit next to a very fragile object like the sunken hull of the Arizona. And then you had to span girders concrete girders across those piles to create this floating platform, this bridge shape. And that was all accomplished by late 1960, this platform. And then again, since the project very quickly over budget and funds were low, the second fund drive that included Elvis Presley was begun and allowed then the building of the so-called superstructure, which is the concrete catenary piece that sits on top of this platform. And here you can see in the yard the preparation of the formwork for this structure on the lower left. And on the right, you see actually a picture of two gentlemen. In the middle is Alfred Preis. Next to him is the famous engineer Alfred E, who designed the engineering for this project, and the next is the partner of Alfred Preis, Thomas Perkins. This photo was probably taken around 1961. Then the formwork is put in place on this superstructure, also a challenging endeavor by itself, because you had to bring in the formwork in. You had very little maneuvering space to place things, and you had to place rebar inside and then bring the concrete in. And finally, by 1962, May 30th, 1962, the structure was completed as we know now. And in May 30th, 1962, the memorial was opened. It shows also some of those dramatic effects that Preis was always seeking with this, almost like this theatralic drawn curtain, and the perspectival, the central perspectival effect that Preis was very much known for. And
I just
here,
if I could jump in on that last slide real quick. Sorry.
You want me to go back? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, real quick. There's a real and this is coming from that wonderful photo of Preis in front of the Karlskirche, St. Charles Church in Vienna. There's an amazing kind of, and it's a Baroque church, an amazing kind of Baroque theatricality to this, especially with that circle window and the idea of the curtains, as Axel mentioned, being drawn to sort of reveal this remarkable space behind. So this sense of theater, you know, this leitmotif, as Axel mentioned, of theater is really working its way into Preis's architecture for the USS Arizona Memorial design. So, thanks. I'll let you play.
Yeah, no, here I'm just going to show this quickly. This is actually this recently discovered footage of the opening ceremony of the USS Arizona Memorial. People are arriving, and obviously the opening memorial. This is a representative of the state of Texas. That would be, I think, Teal, I think was his name, if I'm not remembering this wrong. And Alfred Preis was actually in the crowd here. At some point we can actually see him. I think it was at 6 something, right? And everybody is about to get up and leave. I think, yeah, here you see in the back Alfred Preis here, just behind this gentleman with the white hat, very faintly. And took me a while to find, but I recognized the suit and the glasses. So it's this is the story of the memorial. He went on after that. He went on into a career of advocacy between 1963 until his death in 1994, which also involved the creation of the Hawaiian State Foundation. The foundation, the HSFCA, sorry, Hawaiian State Foundation of Arts and Culture in 1965, and also the creation of the 1% rule, dictating that all public projects invest 1% into the acquisition of art. That was then adopted by many other states. So that was all part of Hawaiians and Alfred Preis's accomplishments that led then, here's the SFCA document that's by the controller. Alfred Preis was at that time executive director. And he died in March 29th in 1994, and his ashes were scattered from the USS Arizona Memorial. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I have a question on the video, Professor, of 1962. What jumped out at you? One of the things I saw was just the barren Pearl City area, no buildings, no high rises, anything. And also the sailors were on the quays. And it was, it was a very historic video. I mean, it's amazing. What jumped out at you?
The water level was lower too. Did you notice that too? Yeah.
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 Yes.
No, I was very impressed by the pristine read of the memorial. Still, I think it had also a slightly different entry dock still because it didn't have the ADA ramp yet. Because by 1962, the American Disability Act was not yet established, and I felt what was very impressive. This is also pretty nice with the Air Force, I think, right, flying over it. And I think you can see here, yes, it's very impressive that no high rises. The city itself was still in the beginning of its growth period. It was less touristy at the time still, although I think at this point it was pretty strong already. I also really do like this the way the light hits everything. It's just so beautiful in this memorial. Yeah, that's what I can say. Laura, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, just the sinuousness of the concrete. So this was actually a really remarkable. Hawaii is known for its prefab concrete structures. I think Axel mentioned that Alfred Yee was the consulting engineer on the project, and Yee was actually known for his pioneering research in prefabricated concrete. So, the qualities that you're seeing in this building are something that are really entirely new for the world. So this is pioneering in a variety of different ways. So I just wanted to jump in with that. And also just, we have these kind of repeated lines, these cutouts, which is very, very Preisian. No one else could have designed the memorial quite like Preis did, because he did it very much in his own form language.
And we have to be also very clear. This is a very unique memorial.
Yes.
This is probably the only modern memorial, a war memorial that the United States really have, except for Maya Lin's memorial in Washington D.C. And it stands out, and it actually holds up in the test of time as well. It is still a remarkable, appearing simple structure, but it actually has some interesting intricacies and complexities that I hope it will last for generations to come still.
I found it interesting. The first rendition of it was didn't have the curve, and it wasn't Mr. Preis is famously quoted as saying that by not having struck first, by having permitted Japan to the first attack, we suffered a major defeat. The form of the Arizona Memorial, the limpness of the curve shows the defeat. The two ends with sharp muscular edges show how we rose out of defeat into ultimate victory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That jumped out at me. But as another point, I was doing some research on Mike Slackman in his book. The late great Mike Slackman wrote about the memorial when he said this: "Today, the USS Arizona stands as a reminder of the events of that Sunday morning. It has different meanings for those that visit here, but to all of them, it speaks silently and eloquently of the distance yet to be traveled before the world lives in peace." Given the many wars that followed World War II, including the present war in Ukraine, what are your thoughts about that passage in Mike Slackman's book about the Arizona Memorial?
I'll just interject one thought, I suppose, before I get into the sort of national or international discourse, is that I think that there's a certain sense in which the memorial is actually also, and I mentioned this to Jim on the phone yesterday, also somewhat autobiographical for Preis, where he, is at this high point in his life in Vienna. And then things take a serious downturn with the annexation of Austria by the Nazis. And he could not have hit any lower, really. But then his eventual flight to Hawaii is this sort of soaring triumph. So there is an autobiographical content which also connects to the international content of war. With referring back to the Nazi regime and World War II in that way. I think, like we were discussing earlier, this issue of, what do we do in Ukraine? Could we potentially be starting World War III if we take more active action? And I think that one of the things that this memorial does is it embodies all wars in the sense that there is always this sort of, high point of cultural achievement, which is then sunken and lowered by war, which hopefully then, in some cases, although not all, reemerges again to greatness. But I do want to bookend that with in not all cases. And I think that could very much apply to the present situation in Ukraine.
Okay, I believe we have a question coming in. Weston? Oh, anyhow, I'll get to that. That's a great point. One other point that I thought and appreciate the very extensive webinar. Really learned a lot about Mr. Preis. He is the author, if you will, of the 1% rule. Can you explain what that is?
All right. Yeah. So this was in the early 1960s, mid 1960s, the National Endowment of the Arts was established, I think. And Preis had, by chance, seen a draft of this and felt that it might be beneficial because he was an absolute advocate for arts and culture, and he felt the public has a right to good art and good exposure of culture, which he felt was a bit amiss at the time in the Hawaii he knew. And so he was not just purchasing art for the State Foundation, which didn't actually have any money. So for him, this 1% rule was an opportunity to set up the so-called Act 298, which was a statewide act, which is the launch of the Art in State Buildings program. So he clarified, to be clear, he wanted actually a lot more money out of this, or more percentile out of this, but through the year-long or 2-year-long negotiation with legislature, it arrived at 1%, and he felt this was appropriate to dedicate 1% of publicly funded projects, to the acquisition of art and to the display, obviously, or maintenance of this art. And that's what this 1% rule is. This is interesting insofar as it sounds like a relatively insignificant thing if you're not into the arts. But the arts has been mostly funded in the United States, not by federal funding at this time, but actually by private people. And the idea that there is suddenly national or statewide funding for art was relatively new. And interestingly enough, and this was taken on by several governments, not just states, but actually also international by several governments, this notion. And we in Austria, we have this as well. And I'm pretty sure it was modeled after the American system at this point. And in the opening show of the New York show, actually, the graphic artist that was printing out our work there came up to me. I did not know that the 1% rule came from Alfred Preis. I'm a beneficiary of this 1% rule. That's what the guy said. I was very surprised, but at the same time, I felt like, well, that's great. I'm surprised nobody knows that Alfred Preis was ultimately the author of it. But it is a very important thing for supporting not just contemporary art as well, but actually just to maintain the cultural achievements of a society. Yeah.
I think we're getting close to wrapping up, but I have one or two more questions regarding the houses that Mr. Preis designed. How many do you think are still standing?
That's a good question. I did a bit of a count. I think there's about 2 handful of them extant enough that you would call them original of the ones that we found. So the documentation of the houses is a bit sparse. But we do have a record of about 160 residences, and out of these, I think like 25 or 30 are still at maximum standing, and several of them are modified so that they either need to be reworked again to the original state in order to be contributing from a historic preservationist point of view, or many of them are also in disrepair. You have to blame a lot of factors on the island for that kind of like very low outcome. Is like one would be clearly the climate and the usually the cheap building material that Preis was using. This Preis built for people, not for wealthy clients. He built for the more average, for the cultured, educated people that didn't have like a lot of money.
Yeah,
and
the title of my book is actually Architect of the People, Alfred Preis in Hawaii, because he was very much engaged with in his housing developments, you know, the lower classes, but also with simply just, you know, lower middle class to middle class residences. So inexpensive building materials were a definite factor. Another factor, of course, as those of us who live in Hawaii know, are land values. And the land is what is costly on the island, not the structures. So, you know, many houses in my own neighborhood are in complete disrepair because it doesn't really matter. You're selling the land, you're not selling the house. And Alfred Preis's own houses have really fallen victim to this one particular issue, which I think is mostly kind of a Hawaii-centered problem.
Thank you, professors. Really appreciate that. So we have a couple of questions here, and I wanted to ask. I have a group from Hawaii News Now. They actually had a couple of questions for you. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for, can you hear me just fine?
yeah.
Hello. So this question is for Laura. Axel alluded to this a few moments ago, but Laura, just, you know, with everything considered, how remarkable is it that this memorial, this structure was able to be built just given the unique circumstances?
I would actually say pretty incredible because, you know, for a long time, as Axel mentioned, the sentiment was, why would you want to memorialize the day that lives in infamy? You know, and I think eventually there was pushback, you know, not only from veterans, but also just from the changes in viewing of the events of World War II, that, you know, pushed for this memorial to finally be realized. But it took a very long time. I mean, we're talking about 20 years between really the end of the war and the completion of the memorial, or maybe a few years after. So, you know, it wasn't something that was immediately thought of. Obviously it was in the Pacific Parks, or not Pacific Parks, I'm sorry, the War Memorial Boulevard, but as Axel mentioned, even that was very controversial at the time because no one wanted to memorialize this, you know, horrible day that was still very much present in the minds of people living in Hawaii at that time. I mean, Pearl Harbor was actively terrifying for people. So why would they want to remember that day? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and just as a quick follow-up, what do you make of how just, decades later, structurally, everything appears to be just so sound, and just
Yeah.
how it seems that this is a memorial that really is poised to stand the test of time.
I absolutely agree. And as Axel mentioned, there are very few or were at the time modernist memorials. We have a handful more now, but they're very atypical. And I think Preis's design is probably the most avant-garde of all of them. But my mother, who is in the audience, was recently there, and she was talking to me about how powerful this structure really is. And what I mentioned before about this kind of Baroque theatrical sensibility, so what Preis is doing is he's weaving together not just modernism. If it was just modernism, it might not be so captivating, but he's weaving together architectural elements and trends that have stood the test of time, so to speak. So he's weaving together the Baroque, he's weaving together modernism, he's weaving together the theater, all into this single building.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then Axel, I have a couple of questions for you. Just thinking about Alfred's life and everything that he endured and everything that he went through, especially here in Hawaii. Would you say that the memorial is one of his greatest achievements? And also, too, did he accomplish the notion of having people feel a certain way and having this be a tribute for everyone? Did you feel that he accomplished that goal when building this structure?
All right, it's a two-part question. I think I'm answering the second one. I might actually hinted at the first part of this, but I did think he was very. I believe he was very satisfied with the outcome of the memorial. He has been very reluctant to describe or embed any meaning in it, because I think he felt that it was very important that people find their own interpretation for the memorial, and I think that's a very humble gesture. At the same time, I think it's also very reasonable given the fact that it has a bit of an abstract autonomy as an object, and it can be read, as Jim read to us, it can be read as a series of events described through a figure. That's one thing, but then you can also look at this inherent drama that is embedded in the piece, as Laura just pointed out. So I think it's from the point of view of his work, I think it is the crowning piece of his architectural career. I've always been wondering what would have happened if he would have continued after that, because he pretty much gave up his practice in 1963 in order to serve the larger planning aspirations that he had, and the culture, the arts. But I do think it's a very worthy point for him to end his career, because like all of his projects, that's what we're trying to talk about a lot, Laura and I, is that they all carry some elements forward, and Preis was equally dramatized by this event. He lived through it too. He was there. He just fled basically the Nazis, and then he was there, understanding that where he is right now, the war has come to him. And then 2 days later, he's going to prison, basically, because he had a Nazi passport, and not knowing what's going to come out of it, not sure at all what's going to happen. This uncertainty that we see now again and everywhere, especially in Europe, particularly. This is unbelievably taxing and mentally taxing on everybody. And he manage to get out of this and keep working. And I think the evolution of the memorial, and I hope we find more information about his various design proposals and other design proposals, shows also how he more and more arrived at this very reduced kind of like object that it is right now, that this is a consequence of him learning how to kind of like be very concise and succinct in his statement about the piece. So yes, I think it is absolutely a crowning achievement in his career. Yeah.
I'd also
go.
follow that up with it's not only a crowning achievement, it's also a very strange achievement in his career, just because he had been working, primarily so much as this architect of the people, as this, Hawaii, regionalist modernist. And of course, he was involved with the AIA and all of this war memorial planning. So it's not strange in that way, but it is strange within the context of what he had been doing before. And where he had been focusing his career prior, as we're seeing in these two houses. It's feasible to me that another architect could have undertaken this design, but Alfred Preis sort of chose to leave these things to undertake this design for the memorial. So it's a crowning achievement, but it's also a very strange achievement at the same time.
And finally, just a quick one, and I leave it up to Laura and Axel who wants to take this. What do you want the people of Hawaii to know about how Alfred just poured himself and committed himself into designing a fitting tribute?
I'll take this first, and then I think I'll let Axel step in and take this too. I think he poured his heart and soul into this, and I think it was because, as I mentioned before, it was not just a work in tribute to the events of Pearl Harbor and the war. It was a work that was almost in tribute to himself and to his own personal life experience. I think that there is these dual readings that can take place. And I think like what we would like to have people take away from all of this is that not only the celebration of the architectural achievement and the achievement of the memorial itself, but also simply, as we're looking at here, the continued preservation of his architecture. I had an NEH grant about 4 years ago to start working on this project, which is a little bit before when Axel joined me in researching this. Now, prior to my NEH grant and all of my initial research, Alfred Preis, outside of the Arizona Memorial, was literally, and some of his buildings like the zoo and Lapahoehoe School, as we're seeing here on the left, was a virtually unknown quantity. And even with Lapahoehoe School, like he was not in the beginning, before our research, given primary authorship of that building. Rather, it was attributed to Associated Architects, the general collaborative firm that he established with his colleagues. So we are very much hoping that what will come out of all of this is not just a celebration of the memorial, but the continued preservation of his vital buildings for the state.
Yeah, I very, very elegantly said. I want to add, like he was always 100% committed person. I mean, he poured almost 20 years of his unpaid time into shaping a community and understanding, to make sure that there will be some form of memorializing these events. That is pretty dedicated, and he and Tucker Gratz probably got pretty well along, my assumption, because they both spent equal amount in this efforts on this, and he was so engaged with his colleagues and his communities, and this was all voluntary work that they did in the 50s and 40s. They were not paid for any of this. This was Alfred Preis getting everybody together and saying, we need to do something. We need to make sure that those fallen soldiers, that those people's memories, that these events don't get forgotten, so we can learn from something. And I think that's a very selfless dedication. I think, as Laura pointed out, his personal events probably influenced this, but I also feel like he was just one of these personalities that just wanted to make sure that there's something given to the public in this case to understand and memorize.
I'd agree with that most definitely, that something in his mind always needed to be given back to the public through the arts and through architecture. And this not only played out in such designs for the Pacific Memorial System, but also in the fact that he was heavily involved in the arts community as an unpaid member. He was on the board of the Honolulu Art Society. He was on the board of the symphony. How he had time to do all of these things and build all these buildings is something that I will completely never understand. He must have slept like 2 hours a night. And his wife, Janina, was also, in on all these activities too. She was an artist herself, so she was heavily involved with the art scene as well. So he devoted himself tirelessly, not to just his own career, as did many architects, including many Hawaii architects, but to public service.
Thank you. With that, we're going to wrap this great session up. I wanted to also make sure that everybody knows that the exhibit opens on May the 30th till July the 15th, and it's going to be at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial. It's free. It's no entry fee into the park, and the exhibit is going to be for 6 weeks. So it was in New York recently. Encourage you to check it out. It's also online. And so, but to go in person is sometimes better. You want to elaborate on that, Axel?
Oh yeah, no, we have, we're trying to figure this out, but we have a lot more work that we show online, and so it will be hopefully interesting for everybody. This is an ongoing discovery, actually, which makes it so interesting, and well, I hope everybody will enjoy it. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for joining us, and we really, on behalf of Pacific Historic Parks, we'd like to thank everyone that participated today. Please put the word out about the upcoming exhibit, and the recording of this presentation will be available on our website soon. And with that, we thank you, and aloha.
Aloha. Mahalo.
Thank you all very much. This was an absolute pleasure, and thank you, Jim, for inviting us to do this. I wish that we had more time, but obviously we don't. I've gotten a few direct questions, which I've answered in the chat.
Okay, great.
But yeah,